All right. Welcome to the 10th lecture in Kent State's Games for Education course. In this lecture, we'll take some time to look at the different ways that transformational games are released or used in research initiatives, who does all this stuff, and, I want to give a good overview of this, I guess you could call it scene or like sub-industry within the games industry. Um, you know, as kind of expected, a lot of you and a lot of people are mainly familiar with the commercial part of the game industry, and of course, that's what is marketed to you. That's what a lot of people are immediately familiar with. But there's this, one thing that we've been doing throughout the semester is really working within this other sector of the industry. And I've mentioned a few times why this should be of some interest. The main thing is that despite having a different focus or a different, a different mission, you still have the you're still using a lot of the actual like skills of game making. Both in the design aspects and in the actual, making the legwork of getting something to run, in a very practical way. And alternatively, I've mentioned that this area is something that can still look like launches on your resume. You are still creating games, you are still publishing works. You're publishing them in a different way, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. But that still shows, a lot of the same things that people would look for on a resume, such as working on teams, collaboration. It shows the ability to launch and push products out the door. And, I've seen people go from this area into commercial games and vice versa. I've seen people go then back because, maybe the commercial games industry had too much crunch or things like that. And that's not to say that all educational game labs are great places. I have heard of and I have encountered personally some pretty toxic cultures at some of these as well. So, as with anything, be on the lookout. But what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, who does transformational game research? Everything from individuals all the way to whole organizations. How are the games released, and in what form? And then how is this research disseminated? I had you do, at least, in the way the class is at the time of this recording, one of the projects was a paper, and what does that paper, how does that information in that game get spread to the world, and specifically to your colleagues in the game industry? And then the case study for today is a game called Game Studies by Pippin Barr that is a wonderfully meta look at the academic discourse of games. So, first of all, who does transformational games research? So, I'm going out of order from the topic slide, and that's a bit on purpose. But the number one thing I want you to know is that organizations tend to be the drivers of this type of game research or this type of game making. So in this, and I'm not going to go into any great detail because this is, sort of a survey of the scene, but, you have different types of organizations, nonprofit organizations. In like Washington, D.C., you might have a lobbying group, or you might have other advocacy organizations like environmental organizations or social organizations, things like that. So these are your expert resources, which your textbook talks about in the transformational framework. And in most cases, these organizations are not making games themselves, but are funding games that are made by other organizations that we'll see on this list. And what they have is either they will have some money in their budget, like maybe this might be the sort of their mission. So, for example, like I have a game here that says Ask, Listen, Learn. That was a game developed in conjunction with a lobbying group for the beverage industry, specifically like alcoholic beverage industry. But the lobbying group was for, teaching kids to stay away from alcoholic beverages until they're 21 and to find positive alternatives to, instead of underage drinking. And so that organization, they had money for advocacy related media projects. And so one of the media projects was, the game lab that I was a part of at the time got some money to make a game, or you'll see people get like specific grant money. So that's where some of this money comes from. Oftentimes is from these organizations that say, hey, I'd like to do this thing and I'd like to accomplish it with a game. So real briefly, I want to talk about individuals making transformational games. I don't want to leave out the possibility that like individual human beings are making these games, and but they're making them in a very different way. But I think this is something important to bring up because some really wonderful, famous games that are very successful in lots of different capacities have been made by individuals. So sometimes these games, have gameplay goals similar to organizations, but a lot of this content is geared towards either advocacy or autobiographical, like this is who I am or this is what I experienced kind of game making. And again, these are incredibly powerful experiences that one, you should check out. Two, you should know that this exists and that you should make them if it so pleases you. But let's see. This is where you see small message heavy games, that are often colloquially called art games. Games like this are typically small and often very expressive of a person's personal experiences. They tend to be short and simple and sweet because of, production. Although, again, like you have the game here, Sibel by Nina Freeman. It's a game that mimics a computer desktop with an instant message program, and and her experiences with like online romance and online communication, which is a really interesting, really cool game. But beyond stuff like that, you typically see things in very, like I said, short, easy to pick up engines that don't require a lot of team members to get going. Again, you have the ever once in a while odd Unity game, but you see a lot of Twine, Pico 8, Bitsy, which is a small world creator, or anything where you can make small games very quickly. That's where you see a lot of these sort of small personal games. Games like this, and especially in Twine and Bitsy, have been compared to zines. So zines being small magazines that people publish when they want to communicate an idea really quickly and cheaply. So people have been comparing Twine to zines a lot of, I want to communicate this idea, but I don't want to have to, take a long time to make the expression of that idea. So that's where you see stuff like this. Again, individuals are making these types of games, and they're making them about really cool personal topics, and they're being really expressive about it. So I wanted to make sure that I covered that, so you know that you could do it too. Next are game studios. So obviously, a whole studio has a larger production capability than individuals. Um, Sometimes they have similar goals to individuals, but their games tend to be far less personal because they are not working from a personal place. They are working, within the organization's game development goals. So games by studios are, as one would expect, apt to have higher production values than games by a single person. Some studios make games with a mission independently. This is often done by studios that specialize in educational games specifically. So, for example, Shell Games in Pittsburgh makes games for clients, but often also will make, entertainment games that are also educational or that have an educational component to them. And that's useful for a number of reasons. One is commercial. Two is to build a portfolio of works that you can then use to get contracts, or often vice versa. Sometimes studios will actually go the other way around. They want to make commercial indie games, but serious games and transformational games can also be a way to keep the lights on. So lots of studios make these types of games. Some of them make them on contract, and some are based on educational games, but not all of them. Ones that again, commercial indie studios that are more interested in entertainment projects, they will occasionally make games on contract, serious games on contract, because that is like a I don't want to say easy or convenient or something like that, but that's like a steady form of income, is that contract work. So, it's not just studios like Shell Games, although that's certainly one, but it's more common than you think. Now, a blend of these models can be found in academic game research labs, like those found at various universities around the world. One such as TAG, the Center for Technoculture, Art, and Games at Concordia University, the American University Game Lab, which I used to be a part of, and RIT's Media Arts Center for Media Arts, Games, Interaction, and Creativity, or MAGIC. So these organizations are typically created via external funding. So what will happen is a university will receive money to open a lab in this area. That funding goes to, potentially space. Usually they carve out a few rooms, on the university, like they'll find some rooms. And then that money will, it's mainly for hiring faculty, so hiring a few faculty members, and then they will continue to get money to build the program. Those faculty members will typically create games for clients. Usually the university has a few clients in mind. Then that faculty member will then go and find other clients to make games for, which will bring in additional money. And then those, all the while, they will also teach classes. And, those classes take different forms. The one I was involved in at American University, we had a master's program. So they were master's students coming in, taking the courses, and in some cases helping with the studio's projects. It varies by place, what level of student you're getting, but usually this does spin off into at least a small game design program. But in these cases, where there's a lab, typically what you see is that the lab comes before the program, but not always. I've seen ones also where there's a program for a while, and then eventually after a few years they start up a lab. But they build partnerships, and then the outcomes of those partnerships become games and then papers about how the game works to accomplish whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. I've talked about my work with educational testing service games in the past, and that was an example where we made some games, and then those games would become like, here's our paper about how we tested this game and whether or not it was effective at teaching math. And let's see. Oh, and then there are other types of academic labs that also publish student projects. So these ones, so University of Utah and NYU, to my knowledge, function this way. I know University of Utah, they have a lot of medical games development, and that's published through their lab. And then students can also have their student games developed and published. And I know NYU actually takes several of the really promising senior projects and will then give money to those students, like through their publishing wing, to develop their games more fully. So there's lots of different ways that these occur in the industry, but they are a place that transformational games get made, because these are the ones doing the development of transformational games as a as their sort of central way of bringing in income. And then, of course, you have individual academic faculty, like your teachers. So there are several different types of job titles that you see within this space, and I'll go over those in the next slide, each with different sets of duties and priorities. Teachers typically have at least a master's degree, but it can vary by field. In games, you see a lot of it depends on the university's rules and the field, but I have worked with people who are they have a bachelor's degree, so a typical 4-year degree, but that's really uncommon for them to be full-time faculty. Again, not impossible, but obviously honestly very, very rare. On the flip side, though, in games you also get people who don't necessarily have PhDs teaching. Like the NYU Game Center, I think, does not. I don't know if they have any PhDs on their faculty, on their full-time faculty, but they're a really wonderful and well-respected faculty. I also do not have a PhD, so at least again at the time of this recording in 2019, it would be a while before I would have something like that, because I'm not currently taking PhD courses. So, it's typically academic faculty typically have either a master's degree or a PhD. First, faculty are responsible for 3 things. So they're responsible for teaching, which is what we do in the classroom and what we do on, Twine, or not on Twine, on streaming video at 6 a.m. It's 6 a.m. when I'm recording this, so pardon the rambliness. So yeah, it's what we do in the classroom and what we do helping students outside of class and grading and all that other fun stuff. But did you know that we do other things too? The next is research, where a faculty member is creating works within their field. So this is where, like, for example, I make games. So I can have that count as my research because of what my field looks like. And my particular guidelines for what my research is allowed to look like. That's not true everywhere. If I were a computer scientist, my research stuff would probably look very different. And for example, this is where, like, I'm frankly pretty lucky to work specifically in the area of games. One thing to know is that academic faculty in the games world are not always housed in specific game design programs. There might be game design classes, but a person's tenure home, which means like where their research is being evaluated, might be in something like computer science or communications. So when it comes to research, professors are subject to the guidelines of whichever academic body is their quote-unquote home. So for example, like computer science friends of mine, they are responsible for bringing in money, not necessarily where we are. I don't really know their guidelines that well. I'm talking about folks I know in the industry. But they're responsible for bringing in money, going to conferences, making, usually making projects. And those projects will, again, attract funding because they are projects that, they're like cool technologies that people will want to use in service of whatever it is they're doing. So, and then again, but in, my case, research can be game publishing. And that's, at several different types of schools too. The other thing that you find in research is publishing things like papers, articles, or books. And that aspect of research, now most people are going to have that at least in their research. And what that means is that you are creating artifacts that add to the field's body of knowledge. So by making a game and then maybe doing something within the design of the game that's really novel, or establishing some process while you design the game, or designing the game about something really interesting, you then write up the paper about it, and then other people can read the paper and then learn from what you did. So it's not just that you are cranking out games, it's that you're cranking out games in a thoughtful way designed to help deepen the understanding of other people making their own games. So that's and I'll talk about game development versus game studies in a second, but that's what research looks like in this area. And then of course service, which is serving committees or other things done for the university community. For example, like when I help students run the Global Game Jam, that is seen as a service activity. So this type of work on campus is another important part of an instructor's job. So again, we're not just teaching. This is why we always seem so busy all the time, because we're not only teaching but also doing research and service activity, and that can be for multiple different initiatives. So the amount of each type of this work that you have varies on what type of faculty you are. So here's a quick breakdown of who these different faculty members are and what type of positions are out there, in case any of you want to get into what we do. Drinking coffee, sorry. So first of all, our adjunct faculty, they are typically responsible only for teaching, and they are not permanent. They're not permanent employees of the university. They're hired typically on a class-by-class contract basis, and they usually either teach at other places. So sometimes people will just adjunct in a ton of different places, or they'll hold entire other jobs. So this is where you get somebody who is maybe doing a day job and then comes in and teaches a class at night for some extra money. So that's what an adjunct faculty is. So again, those are typically only teaching. They're only teachers. So a non-tenure track faculty, and this can take different forms, but and I'll explain what tenure track is in a second. But typically a full-time employee of the university, mainly responsible, again, typically for service and teaching. Some do research on their own, but it really is dependent on how your university views that. That's not to imply that like some see it as a bad thing. Really, it mostly means, does the university have a I guess, reward mechanism for that type of activity? Some do and some don't. Kent does. So which is pretty good. NTTs are treated pretty well at Kent. What you have there is a non-tenure track is you'll hear the term faculty, meaning that maybe they are hired technically on a year-by-year contract, even though that contract is like understood to be more or less renewed every year, because you are a full-time member of the faculty, you are doing committees, you are helping shape the curriculum, things like that. Or you'll hear the term visiting assistant professor, which is another term for non-tenure track. And the reason that you always see it as visiting assistant professor is that in certain academic positions, people don't stay around in non-tenure track position. Again, it depends on the university, but I know in like research focused, if somebody's looking for tenure track, they will tend to bounce around until they find tenure track. That's actually understood as pretty normal. You might hear my dog. She's coming downstairs. But typically non-tenure track, and at least within the context of this school that I'm giving this lecture for, full-time, don't have to do research, but it's often appreciated when they do research, and then mainly responsible for service and teaching. And then lastly is tenure track faculty, which is what I am, and at least in 2019. So, who knows, maybe someday full tenure. But so tenure track faculty are also full-time employees. We do all three, research, teaching, and service, with a heavy emphasis on building a body of research work. So where we are now, again, Kent State University, and within our program, which is run out of the Tuscaroras campus, teaching is the number one activity, because we are very teaching-centric. But you also are expected to have a really robust research area. So research tenure track professors must submit to yearly tenure reviews through a period of 5 or 6 years, and then after which if you are approved for it, you're given permanent positions or tenure in the university. So these are usually the faculty engaging most in the transformational games ecosystem. They're usually the ones that are finding clients, finding funding, or finding organizations to work with, running some of these projects. So that's what you're going to see a lot of in transformational games is tenure line faculty. You will see sometimes NTTs doing some of this work, but it's not always in the seeking out relationships with funders sort of capacity, because non-tenure track faculty don't always have that as part of their guidelines. Excuse me. So, tenure track faculty are the ones that you're going to see making a lot of, publications and productions and things like that. And then in residence positions, there's one last type. In residence positions, those are usually 1 or 2 year limited full-time contracts. And those are specifically to have a professional come in and perform their industry duties while also, like in the university, while also maybe teaching a few classes so that students can benefit from learning from that person. So like, Eastern Kentucky University in Kentucky, obviously, they have a pretty robust residency program where people will come in and stay for a year and make their games and maybe teach a class. And then the benefit of that is that, again, students have that exposure to an industry professional. So, that's the last type. Sometimes those folks are involved in transformational games if it's their area, or if that they're doing their work in, or if they do, the residency is such that you are collaborating with the full-time faculty at the university. But it's just another that I wanted you to know about. So now that you know way more about what it is we do than you ever thought you'd have to, let's talk about how these games are released. first of all is commercially. Many games with transformational themes are released through typical retail markets. So Wingspan here by Elizabeth Hargrave is one such game from the past few years. You'll occasionally see games like this on Steam, or again, in this case, a tabletop game. But at this point, we've discussed at pretty considerable length the benefits of releasing commercially. But as a recap, what's nice about this in the transformational game space is that your game is not only subject to the needs of transformational research, but you also have to make something well crafted that appeals to consumers. And the benefit of commercial is that you're giving yourself another way to look at your success, so that you are avoiding some of the pitfalls of transformational games, which are, that sometimes they can seem cheaply made, and often they are, and sometimes they can seem they're made too fast, often they are. So I'm a big believer in, like, if you can have a hybrid, transformational and commercial, it makes a really nicely appealing product. But this doesn't fit every game. Some organizations want games to be made not for commercial purposes, but to play in other contexts, such as if that organization runs a workshop and it's an educational workshop, so they just want a game for that. Or maybe their game is not even for entertainment purposes, like, at all, and really they want to make a game-like object for use within a research study or within classrooms. And in these cases, the game might need to be delivered more quickly than in a commercial context, so that research can proceed. So this is where you get a lot of, again, it depends on the designer, what they're willing to put into it and their skill. This is the area that, this is the type of game making, and I'm realizing I'm gonna get kind of real here, while also showing a picture of, like, some very nice art from former students' games. So this game was awesome. Let me mention this right here. This game was awesome. It was very pretty. It was another one of those anti-underage drinking games where you were a character it was like a strategy game where you're trying to increase the ability. It was like studying positive peer pressure, basically. So you were like the green brain on the left, and there was a student ripe for peer pressure in the middle, and then the red brain was the bad student that wanted everybody to drink with him. So you had to play this strategy game to try to positively influence more of your friends than the bad brain could negatively influence. So this game was done really well, but there are other games that I've seen that, this is where I think you have to be careful within this area, is that there are folks who are in it, are not experienced game developers, and are there to take advantage of those monetary systems that are in place. Sometimes the organizations funding transformational games don't necessarily know games that well, and will be very receptive to lots and lots of different types of talk about the area. So they end up funding games that are really not very good as games. Again, this is not a case of that. This game pictured is a very good game. So that's why I'm showing it. But, be wary when you do get yourself into a situation where it is just trying to, like, farm some funding, because those also tend to be ones where actual game makers are treated very poorly. So, again, be careful. So this case can be confusing, how they get released for new designers, since they don't mark a traditional release of the kind you think of when you put it on your resume. So my general rule is that if a client has received it and begins using it for their purposes, then the game is released. The key is that on a resume, you should write that it was a serious game created for an organization's internal use or research, which is generally understood within the industry. People know what that is. Serious games are a known entity in the university or in the games industry. So it's not like if you make a game like this, it's going to be confusing because it wasn't on Steam. You really just say, like, I worked for a research lab making a game about avoiding recidivism in the prison system or something like that. And that will communicate as I made a game. And often it can look very good because you are working with a body making games and you are working with external groups such that you're creating something as a service. You have done the work of game making in a professional capacity, and that's really important. So, again, this is not something that is a sort of like lesser version of the industry. It's a different version of the industry, but it has compatibilities. Know where those compatibilities are. Know that people see this as totally legitimate. And again, either it might become your actual game making day job so that you can make your dream game on the side and, have all the benefits of like income and comfort and everything, or it can be the way that you get into the mainstream industry by showing that you have made a game in a professional context with external stakes. That is a released thing. You went through a launch, and that can be very positive. Again, I've seen people jump from transformational game to game studio, and it can happen to you too. So then what about that publishing thing? So when you are, beyond the game itself, and this will be inclusive of game, but now I'm going to talk about, what about that research part of this, and how is that spread? So the first part is journals. So one of the main places that transformational games work is published is in journals. So journals are peer-reviewed periodical publications. A lot of really working the P's there, which means that a board of experts in a field reviews and selects submitted articles. So this review gives a lot of prestige to material. For transformational games, the research is published in either one of the growing number of game designer studies journals, or in a journal from the field for which the game was made. So that external, work part of this, we are game designers, but you might be making a medical game. Well, that medical game is then you're probably working with medical professionals and medical researchers, and that is a sort of like, that should be like an understood thing in all of these is, as you would publish the game by giving it to the client to use in their medical research study. All of these, like, I'm mainly focusing on game industry publications here, but you should also understand that, like, whatever field it's being published in, by, whatever field the experts you're working with, the external experts you're working with outside of games, are coming from, it will, like, the work will likely also be published in their stuff as well. Environmental, medical, educational, whatever. But I'm mainly talking about games here. And I also say the growing number of game designer studies journals because there's a few ones that have been around for a while. Game Studies is one example. But right now, the state of this is largely in flux, because there's just so many journals being started all over the place. Here's just like three that I've, two that I'm very familiar with, one that I kind of grabbed off the internet. I'm not going to tell you which one in case somebody says, oh my gosh, how do you not know that one? But, let's see, peer reviewed. So typically these are collections of, journals are collections of essays, that are peer reviewed, that are typically like an issue of a journal will have a special theme, and then that will, they'll do a call for submissions. You submit your thing, it goes through the review process. If you're selected, you'll usually be asked to make some edits, or suggestions from the peer reviewers of like, have you thought about citing so and so, and then you do it and it's published, and hooray, publications. So journals are wonderful. Let's see. So I mentioned game studies. Well, I mentioned game studies, the field, and the journal. This is me talking about the field. But I should probably clarify what that is. So game studies is the field of academic inquiry around games, specifically the act of playing them and the cultures that surround them. So it is the act of studying the implications of games, less so than like studying the making of games. So it's approaching games as aesthetic objects and not from a developer's perspective. So, here we have some recent and not so recent at the time of this, presentation, and not so recent examples of books within games, within game studies. So studying games from the perspective of humanities studies, or from social sciences studies, or cultural studies, like gaming the Iron Curtain. So what it was like gaming in Soviet Russia, or queer game studies. So like LGBTQ studies applied as a lens for understanding games and things like that. Values at play. So it's like, how do games embody certain values? Kind of like what we've talked a lot about in this class, to just pure straight up game analysis. But that's what game studies is. It's applying many different lenses to understanding games as a cultural phenomenon. It's not games journalism. I should be super clear about that. What happens on games journalism sites is not game studies. That's games journalism. That's reviews and industry news. So sites like IGN and Kotaku, unless they run a special article from game studies, typically not game studies. It can be approached from lots of different directions. The most dominant at the time of this recording, for reasons too numerous to explain here, are social science-based research of players and play. I'm not entirely happy about that. As a design scholar who doesn't think we have the actual object figured out yet, but that's a rant for another time. Some game studies people also make games, but some game studies people, don't make games at all and only write about games. And what you're going to get is some game studies people are in a dedicated games program. Like I've said before, with tenure track, some game studies people are within a dedicated games program. And usually those are people who are also game designers. But then you also have people who are not at all in a game studies program, but choose games to be their area of study. And, that's where you get people in the humanities, people in the social sciences, and that's why they tend to have those lenses, those ways of seeing games, is because games are not actually their field of both what they got their degree in and what they are like in a department they're in. So, game studies are very, very diverse. Although, again, the dominant thing right now is sort of this like social sciences cultural thing, which, I really enjoy, but I also kind of wish that there was more space again for design folks. And then lastly, there's games research that isn't done by game designers or academics. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I skipped one. Uh, Next is academic game development, where you make games as a part of research. So we looked at game studies, but this is making games as part of research. And this can and does include theory from game studies, but often in a way that's applied to actual game making process itself. So like rules of play, a game studies text, but it's also a game studies text that I think does a really good job of applying things in a very practical manner. Lots of game studies texts can be very in the clouds, and I'm not even talking about the ones that Johan Huizinga. He's a little. I'm really tired of being told to cite him for different reasons, but that's a lot of the some of those not always like again useful in a if your study is mainly sociology or culture, but not always. Well, even Huizinga, there's pushback against it because of outdated attitudes, we'll call them. But some of the stuff is not always meant to be practical. This is like if you're using game studies in academic game development, you're using it in a practical way. And again, that's why I like rules of play, because it is both. Eric Zimmerman makes games, and thus it has a very game developer's point of view. So again, game studies applied to the game making process. And then sometimes these academics are the game makers in externally funded game projects. So this is a picture of the game Bruckle by Bob DeShooter at Miami of Ohio. And it's a game about you explore his grandmother's house. And it includes recordings of his grandmother talking about her life and the history of the house. And so that has very deep external and expressive content. It has a very personal subject matter. It's a I would call it a transformational game because of these external aspects. But it's also made to be a commercial game, and it's made to be an experience that people would find interesting and novel in a game marketplace. So, and it's done really well in festivals and things like that. So that is an example of academic game development. It's made within an academic environment, often with some external or research purpose. And what I like about academic game development in that way is that you're really in serving those two purposes of, you might have a commercial interest to it, but it also has this research component. You end up just making really novel games because, it's like make a game but deeply research something that a game wouldn't always necessarily be about, or that, will add a lot of content to your game. So this goes back to that whole week 5 lecture on research, that why it's important. It makes cool games. And then lastly, I don't have a picture for this one, but there is game research that isn't done by game designers or academics, but for other fields. This is where games are applied for non-games research, usually with the help of an external funder. So, see previous discussion of organizations funding game research. Next come conferences. These vary by size, location, and sometimes expense. Generally, they're industry gatherings where people can present their work and research and their research findings to their peers. Transformational games can be presented at most games conferences. There's usually a track for them, or just design talks, things like that. But events that specialize in these types of games include, but are not limited to, but ones to know about is Serious Play. Now, its location varies within the U.S. It was in Virginia for the last few years, but at the time of this recording is in Florida. Who knows where it'll go next, but it tends to jump around. Games for Change, which is always in New York City as part of the Tribeca Film Festival. And that's usually in the spring. Serious Play is usually in the summer. The GDC Educator Summit, which is part of GDC, which is typically March in San Francisco. Educator Summit, those are typically talks about teaching game development specifically, or teaching games, teaching with games, et cetera, et cetera. Different aspects of games in specifically education or teaching, but you will occasionally get a research talk in there. And then again, you can also, if you do have a pure research talk, they do occur at GDC itself, outside of the Educator Summit. But it's a place to look. A lot of the people who are doing this research also present at the Educator Summit. Digital Games Research Association Conference, or DIGRA. That location varies worldwide. Typically, those conferences occur in the summertime. Foundations of Digital Games. Location, again, varies for that, typically in around California. But DIGRA and Foundations of Digital Games in particular take research papers and have what are called proceedings, which is the publication of the research papers from the conference. So, a popular, they're both also popular like paper formats for research in transformational games. So, the papers you do, it might even be worth thinking about whether to put them in DIGRA or Foundations of Digital Games, or FDG. So, those are things to think about. They do, I have seen students get their work published there. Meaningful Play, which occurs every 2 years at Michigan State University. So that, likewise, you can have papers published there, and they also have a games festival. And then there's also other academic conferences, very small ones, usually at different places around the world. So it's good to keep an eye out on those. And then lastly is festivals, many of which take place at the same conferences where you can present your research. Many of those conferences have game showcase tracks, but I wanted to highlight 3 here that I think are really nicely focused on transformational games, and that also, offer awards or some type of like special acknowledgement of transformational games. So again, most of those conferences have this, have some sort of games showcase, but these are specifically, places where where they're offering more of like, an IGF, like submit your game and be acknowledged by the development community sort of feel. So these feel most like what you see in the commercial industry. First is the Serious Play Conference. The deadline for submissions is usually around January or February, which, and this is, at least at the time of this recording, this is being held as a fall class. So it puts you in pretty good position to submit to Serious Play as a group if you can afford the submission fee. That's the downside of Serious Play. But the awards occur in July. You don't have to travel unless you get a gold medal, which would be a wonderful problem to have. Offers awards for games, takes digital and non-digital games. So this is one to consider submitting to. The second is the Games for Change Festival, which takes place every year in New York City during the Tribeca Film Festival. It only takes digital games. Trust me, I've asked. But its submission deadline is usually in April. And it's a pretty good... All of these are really good conferences and have really good gatherings of people too. So, it's worth being part of these also for the networking. Lastly is Meaningful Play, which likewise offers awards. It takes place every 2 years at Michigan State University and in East Lansing. For those who are who are super Ohio State fans, remember it is at Michigan State, not Michigan. We are not as mad at Michigan State as we are at Michigan. So, or at that, the team up north, they are a team who are up north, but not the team up north. So, get over it and go present your game in Michigan. Its submission deadline usually occurs in May for the typically October event. But Meaningful Play is excellent. You should absolutely submit to that. And again, all of these deadlines occur, after the semester for this class is over. So your game prototypes are well positioned to be submitted to all of these. So it's something that I think as you develop things for this class, definitely consider submitting your work to this. We've had students at Kent who have had their games accepted to things, and often the only difference between the teams that have their games accepted and those that don't have their games accepted to festivals is frankly that it's the courage of the team that goes ahead and submits. So, you miss 100% of the chances you don't take. So why not submit your game to festivals? Get notoriety. That'll look really good on a resume. So do it. So your case study this week, so that's the end. The case study this week is the Game Studies by Pippin Barr. And to be honest, there really isn't a great way to demonstrate this week's topic in a game, unless you were to read a bunch of papers, which you can do. They're in the syllabus. But as many of the games you've seen so far are festival winners, I guess that's the only other way to look at it is play some festival winners to see what they're like, which again, go check them out. They're in the syllabus. But this week's game, frankly, is just one that uses gameplay to demonstrate particular topics and theories of game design studies. And I think it's fun. It's short. It's really short. But I also think, again, and I say this as somebody who is steeped in game studies and game design studies, I also think the game is really snarky and hilarious. So you, at this point in your careers, may not think it's snarky and hilarious or even understand what's going on. But trust me, it's snarky and hilarious for those of us who are, again, deeply, neck deep in this. So give it a try. It'll take, 10 minutes to play. But yeah, go check it out. Your assignment, it says week 7. It should say week 10. Sorry about that. Your project assignment is more prototyping. Keep prototyping. Write playtest reports as you playtest, and please turn them in on Blackboard. You're kind of in the process, or you're in the routine now. So just keep at it. And then again, sorry, it says week 7. It's week 10. So answer this in 50 words or more. How can you or will you assess whether your game is effective with its target audience? So remember, that's the other part of this, is you're going to make a game, but you also have to test whether it's effective at its transformational goals. How are you going to do that? So research, and then the other part of this is research the topic area that you're making your game about. Report at least one place where you might be able to publish your research. And I mean non-games place. So don't everybody just say, oh, DGRA. Because duh, but where might an environmental, a game about, the environment be published? What are some environmental publications or conferences or journals that are maybe even in the past have done stuff with games? I don't know. You tell me. So that's what this assignment is about. That's it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll take it easy on your instructors now that you know that they're not just teachers, but are also researchers and on committees and running around and, going crazy with all the mounting to-do lists. So that's it. Thank you for watching and listening, and happy game development.